One way in which we use the conventions of a horror movie is through characters. Through research of typical horror conventions and planning, we chose the victim of the film to be played by Cheyenne. In the casting of Kelly as a 16-year-old petite Black Caribbean racial background, partly conforms to the stereotypical horror convention of the final girl. She fits the role in the way that she's a lot smaller than the murderer, displaying her vulnerability, which makes the audience fear for her when it comes to her destined fate. We decided to go against the conventions of a horror film to appeal to a wider metropolitan demographic, subverting the usual cliché convention of a vulnerable blonde. Some well-known vulnerable blonde cliché girls are Michelle Pfeiffer in What Lies Beneath, Lisa Wilcox in A Nightmare on Elm Street, and Drew Barrymore in Scream. When researching horror films, we also discovered that in many films, the editing and special effects are what makes the film scarier. It creates a sense of horror and disturbance. For example, in the trailer of Insidious, the images are fast-paced, with flashing images. We saw how successful these conventions made horror films and decided to replicate these conventions to make our opening sequence a success. Within our sequence, we used the black and white effect to create tension. We also used a flashing effect, which shows how psychotic Stacy's mind is. Finally, we used slow motion and fast-paced effects to increase tension and suspense. Our title uses the conventions of a horror film by including the title at the end of the sequence. This leaves the audience in anticipation of what the name of the film is. It is also reflective as it is unexpected. The font of the title used looks like it is splattered in blood, linking in well with the fact that we have just seen one of the characters being stabbed. We used inspiration from the film Chopping Mall, whereby the font of the title is dripping in blood. We decided that using a font like this would emphasize the genre of the film and signify what the plot may entail. Within our opening sequence, we used 3 different pieces of music. We used the conventions of horror films because we included music which was typical of a horror film. For example, using inspiration from Saw, The Ring, and dubstep music, in order for the music to fit with the atmosphere and mood of the opening sequence. We used the conventions of a horror film when thinking about setting because we wanted the setting to fit with the storyline. For the gathering scene at the start of the sequence, we used inspiration from Sorority Row, using a living room where most people would gather for a party. We then used a dark alleyway for the murder sequence, making it typical of a horror scene. In conclusion, we used, developed, and challenged the conventions of horror films to make sure that our opening sequence of a horror film was a success.